In a data-driven world, companies want to measure every function with hard numbers, and HR is no different. But are there parts of an HR function that lend themselves to data-driven metrics-based measurement? And how do you take into account the role that other functions play in driving HR outcomes like retention or hiring and things like that? Let's close the loop on this. Joining me on Close the Loop is Ashish Singh. Ashish is the head of HR at Misho. Ashish, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Ashish, why should HR really move towards this metrics-driven measurement business?
Yeah, this is an oft-asked question. So why should HR do this? My sense is there are two primary reasons why HR should be moving towards a metric-driven, measured way of working. One is mostly how do we measure impact of a function? It typically, not just to prove to others, but just for ourselves. Are we doing the right things? Is it leading to impact, right, as HR professionals? I think knowing what metric to chase is important. So that's typically one. Secondly, particularly in HR, though in many other functions as well, there are points of views that this is the right thing to do versus that.
Right.
Especially in HR, these both point of views can tend to be equally right.
Correct.
Right? Difficult to choose which is the right thing to do. And sometimes when you have a data outcome, then you can run an experiment and show, hey, this works better.
Correct.
I think in at least those two terms, how do we measure impact and what is the right thing to do? Measuring HR helps.
Okay. But given that, of course, it's turned the people function. So, but in a sense, in reality, HR is probably enmeshed in the organization, in all parts of the organization, more than any other, like marketing or sales. So how do you take into account the role that all these other organizations play? Like, for example, if you want to define a set of metrics around, let's say, retention metrics, right? Now, retention is not just the job of HR, right? So it is the job of a manager, it's the job of the business leaders. So how do you bake that into even wanting to measure retention as an HR metric?
Yeah, so there is obviously a host of people, processes, systems that can have an impact on something like retention or for that matter experience of an employee. But in many ways it is very similar to how marketing measures itself, right? They would go out and say, hey, my job is to get customers in.
Right.
But a lot of times customers may not come in for various other reasons attributable to other functions in the organization, maybe the delivery, maybe the app that you have, many other things, right? So from that perspective, there will be the best way in which any organization is structured is to say that HR is accountable for these numbers.
Right.
But they can get it delivered by influencing everybody else.
Right.
Similarly, finance is accountable for costs, but everybody else works towards meeting those goals. So from that perspective, I think it helps to have this one person who is accountable for that number. How do we measure something like a retention or for that matter, anything else? Retention, by the way, is a very bad example. I do feel that...
Yeah, sure. Give me another one.
Because retention, sometimes especially attrition...
Retention fits my argument.
Yeah. So, because it's eventually the reason for attrition is generally a perception of either the HRBP or the manager. It's one person's perception that we go after.
Yes.
Generally, things which are like this, we should be very careful of, or at least we should know what it is.
Right.
There are other things which can be more clearly measured.
Can you give me some examples? I'm curious to know, like, are there some things that are very clear that HR alone is accountable for this and we can measure that?
HR, I think, is largely a function which works with others, right? A largest factor is really the manager, or the hiring manager. But there are a host of things which HR can, which can be measured very, very clearly. For example, starting from the entire cycle of an employee, hiring related aspects can be measured very easily. The speed of hiring,
the talent acquisition. Yeah, that's almost like lead generation.
It's like lead generation. So all of that can be measured. Candidate experience can be measured very easily, and so on and so forth.
And what are you seeing out there? If I were to ask you, what is the state of the union in terms of HR measurement in the industry today? What are some of your observations?
There are a set of things where traditionally HR has been measuring or organizations have been measuring very, very clearly. And there are aspects which are tough to measure or are not so prevalent
Okay.
in the industry. The aspects which are very easy to measure or very prevalent are largely things around hiring, headcount related, cost related,
Yes.
joiners, leavers,
Yes.
attrition. People also have metrics around reasons for leaving, though I have doubts how accurate they are. The tough ones, on the other hand, are generally things around talent density, you know, the quality of talent.
The skill pool that you have.
The skill pool that you have.
Right. You're a senior CHRO. You worked for large organizations and high growth startups. What would you want to be accountable for to your founders?
I'll talk about how we work here at Misho. So we take a few large goals first, and then we break it down. We call them BHAGs. So for me, the BHAGs are employee experience, what we call ENPS. This is a periodically run survey. People answer those surveys, host of questions.
It's a dipstick that you keep
It's
doing.
like a dipstick that we do frequently, and in all different aspects. But that's one of the BHAGs. The second one is we measure talent density, is the quality of talent. What's the quality of talent coming in? Should be high, the quality of talent going out should be low, and that's how you keep increasing it. Thirdly, there are there are aspects around which can be interim. For example, org health. Is my org pyramids right, spans layers right, etc. Which are the three that BHAG level we pick up. And then obviously we find out where the problems are within it and identify areas to put that.
How relevant are Glassdoor ratings? I think a lot of HRs go into a dizzy when Google reviews and Glassdoor ratings, sort of dip.
Yeah.
So, do you feel that there is an external metric ecosystem also that needs to be plugged into the measurement?
Yes. So it's a good indicator to go and get pulse about what people are writing.
Right.
We look at Glassdoor ratings. Particularly more than ratings, what is written there.
Yes.
It does help a lot, especially because it does influence the candidates who are applying.
Yes.
So from that perspective, it is a very important thing. But there's also this other side, there are a few arguments which also say that, hey, there is so much and we should be careful about what we are doing. One is the fact that it's an outcome metric.
Right.
Is there a way I know what levers will influence Glassdoor? Eventually, those levers tend to again become employee experience, the culture, the host of other things, which we are measuring already.
Correct.
Right? So in that sense, just chasing Glassdoor rating may be wrong. The other thing is sometimes the Glassdoor ratings, particularly if they come from, there's a small sample set. The tendency is people who are generally, and this is like any other.
It's like the extreme cases, right?
Extreme
if you're very
cases
happy or very unhappy.
Yeah. So that's what reflects there. Similar is the case with any customer service as well. So that's something we should usually keep in mind. But my sense is it's a good outcome metric, and from that perspective, just read it.
And if you look at the various different sizes of organizations, so you've been in large companies as well as the high growth companies. So at what stage do you think HR people should start looking at building a metric system, and up to what point is it okay to not have?
What is right, I'll come to what I've seen in the industry. Generally what I've seen is there is from the starting phase of a company startup, usually the founders have a pulse of what's going on. Small number of people, I have hired them, I can maintain the bar. Yeah. I know what the culture is because the founder really is driving the culture till a certain stage where I don't know who is getting hired. I don't know if everybody's experience is right. I don't know if they are doing the right thing in rating the individual or the performance and so on. That's the stage where for the first time, I want to know some metric that things are going right. And typically it starts with either a metric around performance rating. Till that point, I have seen people know everybody anyway. So then gradually it builds from there, that there should be some way we should know whether we are doing the right things or not for people.
And if you were to sort of provide maybe 2-3 words of advice to anyone who is either they have a set system in place or maybe as a way for them to look at it again with a fresh pair of eyes, with in a way of critiquing the system, what would be those 2-3 things that every HR person should look for in the current metric system to judge whether it's kind of working for them?
I personally, from what I have seen, there are mostly organizations who focus only on sort of attrition, hiring data, and not much beyond that. So when I critique my own function, I do feel there is a host of areas where it's possible to come to metrics, but we don't.
Right.
We don't, and that leads to a host of other problems downstream where it's difficult to sometimes have that conversation that hey, HR is creating an impact. Are they on the table or not? On the decision making table? It sometimes becomes very difficult to influence other leaders to say hey, this is the right thing to do versus that, because hey, it becomes opinion after a point. So the way I look at how the measurement of HR is, I do firmly believe that there can be a lot more that can be put in place. We have tried a lot of it at my current organization.
Can you share some examples that have worked for you?
So, for example, let me pick up talent density itself. It's one of the unique concepts, very hard to measure, but we have picked it up and we've tried to measure it. And the way we thought about this is to say that, okay, let's think of how the flywheel should operate. If I am able to get good quality talent in, when they are in, I am able to differentiate who is better versus others. Third step, I am able to make sure that the better ones stay with me and are engaged. And theoretically, the not so good ones could ideally.
And how do you do that? Is it through assessments or is it feedback from the manager, or how do you figure out that one is better than?
Yeah, so this is like sort of a framework initially, and now when I pick each of the 4 pillars of this, the first pillar is somebody is better. A good quality talent is coming in. The thing that we have done is we said that we hire people only if there is at least one spike. So we don't hire people who have all higher ratings from.
Right.
There needs to be one strong higher rating that the individual should have. And it makes hiring very tough. A lot of rejections, but
so the strong hire is you have to have at least one.
You have to have one before you come into Misho. So that takes care of hiring good talent. Retention, what we have worked on is to make sure that the calibration committee, there are a lot of processes put in place to make sure that the calibration committee is set up at various stages. Then they are able to evaluate clearly who are the better performers versus others. And then we take metrics around retention of top performers. And we are a very high talent density organization. So we also measure, low performer percentages, etc. in terms of exits. So if all these 4 are moving in the right direction,
then you know that you are setting up the organization for success.
Density. Yeah. So in every case, what we have tried to do is we try to figure out, is there a way we can measure this before we start work? Otherwise, it becomes very, and it takes a lot of deliberation to arrive what is that right metric, because then the energies get focused.
The other end of the spectrum, before we wrap up, any metric which you felt is like a kind of a vestigial organ that should not be measured at all for HR?
I think almost all companies talk about attrition percentage is fine, but after that, the reasons for attrition, right? I always kept feeling that the reasons for attrition, if you ask 3 people, are 3 different reasons for the same person. The manager will say something else, the HR people will say something else. The employee herself is giving another reported reason for it.
Right.
Generally, the trigger tends to be 1 to multiple things for which somebody starts to look out. Especially compensation related reasons are generally an outcome. In our kind of a market, if I get higher comp outside, I will always get higher comp outside. But the reason for me to start looking out might have been different.
That's the main thing.
Yeah. So sometimes that, the accuracy we should be careful of. Is there a better way to do this? There's no better way to know what happens, why somebody is leaving.
All right. Thanks a lot, Ashish. I think really solid inputs, and I'm sure that our HR audience will really benefit from what you've shared with them regarding measuring HR. Thank you for coming on close.
Thank you so much for having me.